Hi guys, this video contains spoilers for all things Final Fantasy VII. I wanted to bring a few new thoughts and ideas to the table about Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now my thoughts will mainly focus on story and character since, as a writer, that's what I'm most interested in. I should begin the video by telling you that for about 15 years I'd been cautious of a Final Fantasy VII Remake, ever since Advent Children, when Tetsuya Nomura and Kazushika Nojima, with god-tier acrobatics, shallow characterization, and a slow and unsatisfying plot, tore apart the fabric of everything I thought they'd agreed was Final Fantasy VII. In the years that followed, I often wondered if the restrictions of the PlayStation 1 made for leaner, tighter storytelling by accident. Almost like shelving the absolute absurdity because it simply wasn't achievable. The Final Fantasy VII compilation seemed a world away from the original game I still loved so dearly. Yes, I remained a pessimist through the years, one of those forum commenters or social media group posters, adamant that Square Enix would one day press the remake button, but that they'd find a way to blow it in the process. The 13 trilogy and the botched treatment of the Final Fantasy VII spin-offs were my ammunition. I was never a gleeful antagonist to die-hard Square Enix fans. In fact, it pained me to acknowledge the stark dip in quality in the series. When Remake was finally announced, I couldn't imagine how Square Enix could pull it off. I'd not been completely satisfied with a Final Fantasy title since 2002. The announcements of a staggered release schedule and Tetsuya Nomura as director only heightened my sense of dread, and after playing Kingdom Hearts 3, my anticipation levels had been bled dry. My only solace being that Yoshinori Kitase, the original game's director, was involved in some capacity, and that he might help steer the remake ship away from the wild and frankly terrifying mind of Nomura, the barmy captain tasked with piloting the most lucrative ship in Square's armada. My relationship with the remake is a complicated thing. I found it fun to play for the most part. I've done everything there is to do, leaving me to stalk Sector 7 rats with my limit break. Those poor bastards. It was amazing to jump back into a Midgar that felt both nostalgic and fresh at the same time. And during a global pandemic, the game certainly kept me entertained. In some ways, Remake proved me wrong, while in other ways, its mistakes made my initial fears seem paltry in comparison. Remake is a wild ride, and this is my full, honest critique: the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm going to start with Cloud, since his characterization was what annoyed me most about Advent Children. In my fan documentary The Fall of Final Fantasy, I discuss how Advent Children Cloud is a regressed character, several steps back from the development laid out in Final Fantasy VII, and I worried that Square Enix had lost sight of who Cloud is. In Final Fantasy VII Remake, Cloud is an excellent character lead. Good characters are like diamonds. As you turn them, new light and new darkness are revealed by new angles. Cloud is strong, yet vulnerable. He is cold, yet shows a measure of warmth. He feels three-dimensional. And the fact that he is at heart a good person, demonstrated by how he treats his comrades through his actions, means that he has my empathy and support long before I even need to know about his tragic background. With money as his motivator, even at the risk of seeming ruthless, it means that Square Enix understood that angle of the original Cloud, and weren't afraid to give audiences an apparent anti-hero. He isn't here to make friends, at least that's what he tells himself. At the start of the game, he's a rigid and indifferent mercenary, but as the story progresses, his conflict with Barrett and his stonewall approach to dealing with people begin to fall away. Later, even using humour as a means to test the water and establish connections. In Remake, all of the elements that formed Cloud in the original game are slightly dialed up. There's a hint of mystery, Cloud seeming to relish the compliments, the role of badass mercenary. They're planting seeds about his backstory, his own confidence issues, without giving everything away for newcomers. Well, I say that, but then Hojo outright tells Cloud he was never in Soldier, but let's forget that for now. I'm focusing on what worked here. The fact that Cloud is likeable, and from what I've seen, fans seem to be in agreement, makes this the remake's crowning achievement.
Nailed it, I know, thank you. Moving on.
What else is good about Remake? Character moments. Whether it's Barrett giving a rousing and inspiring speech to his eco-terrorist comrades, Tifa being a voice of reason, strung like a clothesline between pleasing Avalanche and following her own sensibilities, or Eris's fun and fearless handling of her ruthless Turk babysitters, I can't deny that Square Enix did these characters justice. It's not rocket science, I guess. They did it more than 20 years ago, but it was still a joy to see these fully formed characters return and expanded upon. With Remake, Square Enix added a lot of fluff, but they also gave characters room to breathe. Jessie, Wedge and Biggs are all given ample screen time. I guess I never really thought about Jessie's backstory before. Who is she? In the original game it was enough to say, here's this person, and she's a member of Avalanche. I didn't question it. Maybe I presumed she'd grown up in a world where Shinra had destroyed everything she loved. In Remake we learned that she's an aspiring actress. Her father's accident at a Shinra warehouse propels her to Avalanche's cause. And it's all good stuff, exactly what you'd expect to see from the opportunities a remake provides a story. When the game builds on the work done in the original, it really hits some powerful notes. And I don't even think the game's most ardent critics are denying that. I've said it before in my other videos, but turning Shinra headquarters into a guided tour was a genius move. From a spectacle point it looks and sounds amazing, but from a storytelling point it also serves to provide exposition not just about Shinra but also the Ancients too, through the window of Shinra's propaganda machine. A clever narrative tool that didn't feel out of place. An example of how Square Enix took something from the original game and made it better. The battle system was great fun once I got the hang of it. It was most rewarding on hard mode, where I was forced to stop relying on items to get me off the ropes, and had to truly experiment with materia and armor setups. And once I got the hang of shortcuts and fast switching between characters, I really enjoyed it. The final fights I had in the game, the Shinra VR sim, were some of the most fun and nail-biting fights I've had in a game probably since Bloodborne. And although the stagger system can be a pain when you can't find the right ability to crack it, and the party AI mechanics have issues, it never stopped my enjoyment. Did I miss Final Fantasy VII's turn-based combat? Maybe sometimes when Remake was kicking my ass, but the battle system was always one thing I was willing to concede, as long as the story and characters held up. There's only one Nobuo Uematsu, and any Final Fantasy composer has the unfair burden of trying to fill his shoes. These guys did an incredible job. The soundtrack is stacked with amazing music, whether it's poignant remixes of Nobuo's classics, or brand new material. By and large, it's a phenomenal soundtrack. Like the wonderful moonlit wandering theme which accompanies Cloud and Aeris' journey to the Sector 7 gate. The pumped up remix of Tifa's theme. Or Ghoul, one of the fabulous new battle themes. The bad. Overpowered. Advent Children infects this game in more ways than one. The ludicrous acrobatics have returned, pointless leaps and bounds that make our heroes seem more super than human. I mean, if you want to end the game with overpowered heroes after you've traced the length and depth of Gaia and found every materia and summon, that's one thing. But isn't it a little early for the Superman moves? It was Advent Children that turned Cloud into a superhero. The original game was far more grounded. Look at Cloud here. He's not even left Midgar yet and he's performing god-tier aerial maneuvers and facing off with Sephiroth, the greatest soldier of all time. I mean, who needs soldier anyway? Who cares if Cloud lied about his past? It looks like he's already surpassed them in every way, shape and form. I have no doubt in his abilities, no fear in facing off with Sephiroth again. This Cloud will mop the floor with him. Speaking of the famous villain, do you remember in the original game how Sephiroth was a name carefully placed? His legend far preceding him, a blood trail, a sword, Shinra HQ deftly infiltrated, its president silently murdered by a master killer. Just when you thought you'd spend an entire game taking down Shinra, the stakes are raised even further and your focus shifts. In Remake, Sephiroth lurks around every corner for a quick chat. You even fight him at the end of the game and come out on top. In fairness, the fight is fun, and could Motorball or a souped up Roche have worked as a final boss? Or would it have been anticlimactic? I guess Square Enix backed themselves into a corner by making this a Midgar exclusive game. Maybe they didn't feel confident that Shinra was enough of a threat, or maybe they felt that every fan from here to eternity would kick up a furious stink if their favourite villain wasn't involved somehow. They felt that they had no other choice but to use Sephiroth to create a satisfying conclusion. In the original game, by the time we escape Midgar and witness Cloud's first flashback, Sephiroth is a legend we've only heard whispers of. And through Cloud's story we learned that he was a decent man, an ally, a hero, but everything went wrong. In Remake, Sephiroth is a villain pure and simple. The game makes no effort to hide it. He's overused through the entire story, each appearance chipping away his mystique. I guess he was serious in Advent Children when he said he didn't want to be just a memory. How will Square Enix build tension around Sephiroth in future installments? Intrigued NPCs sharing tales of a mysterious figure in a black cape, a gutted Midgar Zolom cast aside in the marshes. After already coming nose to nose with Sephiroth at the end of Remake, these moments don't seem to build the same anticipation and excitement that once surrounded the Man in Black. For veteran players, Remake offers us up a Sephiroth who we already know, and we're invited to accept him as an established villain, a familiar face. The same Sephiroth who I already blitzed with Omnislashed at the end of Final Fantasy VII, and whose remnant was ushered away in Advent Children. They're not trying to recreate that tension from the original game, further made evident by the removal of the Jenova blood trail and skewered Shinra guards. A completely different direction, which would be fine if it was effective, but in Remake Sephiroth feels overused and tiring in an already busy plot. My least favourite new character is Roche, the motorbike worshipping soldier who strikes up an instant rivalry with Cloud. He's only featured in 2 scenes, but his prowess with a 2-wheeled vehicle puts even Advent Children acrobatics to shame. I'm fine with this guy being a biker nut, equipped with his own collection of motorbike puns, but he's incredibly vapid. One of my storytelling pet peeves are villains who are just villains because they want a worthy opponent. Villain wants to fight hero because he needs a challenge. Hero beats villain. End story. I did expect Roche to be piloting or replacing Motorball at the end of the game, but I guess even Square Enix forgot about him after Chapter 4. I think he could have worked if they'd have fleshed him out more. For example, what if Roche's family had been killed in an Avalanche bomb, making Roche a sort of terrorist hunter and a terrifying nemesis for Avalanche? And when he meets Cloud, he's so disgusted that a former soldier would side with terrorists. He tries to defeat Cloud to restore soldiers' honour. Their rivalry could have ended in a blaze of glory on the Midgar Expressway, Roche losing his life perhaps. Cloud and party would be forced to understand what motivated Roche, and perhaps reinforce in this complicated world that their own actions are not without sin. It's just an example, but it's the sort of storytelling I prefer, where it puts heroes and villains in grey areas, not a million miles from each other, only their ideals separating them. Which leads me to Avalanche. In the original game, Avalanche's actions caused colossal damage, and Barrett was all too aware that to make strides, innocent life would be lost along the way. You got the sense that Avalanche's motives were right, but their execution was debatable, non-perfect. But in a world strangled by Shinra, it could never be perfect. So, as stewards of the planet, they were making difficult decisions, which cast them in a morally grey area, perhaps justifying the criticism hurled their way, or at least you understood why the public lambasted them. In Remake, the game tries to lessen Avalanche's actions. Their Sector 1 reactor bomb only aims to disable the Mako pump, but Shinra steps in to dial up the damage. In the original game, there was a certain level of ambiguity over how much Shinra had to do with the level of destruction Avalanche's bombs caused, but it was sort of left up in the air, and Barrett seemed satisfied with the damage Avalanche had caused. In Remake, it's obvious that Square Enix are trying to paint Avalanche in a more sympathetic light, weary of their morally grey status. Square Enix forgetting that some of the best storytelling involves characters that do questionable things. It didn't stop people rooting for Tony Soprano or Walter White on TV, or even a bunch of misfits in a 1997 Japanese RPG you may have heard of. But attempting to clean up Avalanche's image just creates more plot holes. Why destroy a pump that Shinra could just replace? If you're Barrett, you know you're only getting one shot at this reactor. There won't be a next time, so it makes sense to destroy the entire thing. Why risk your lives for a pump, which, knowing Shinra, they'll have back on its feet in no time? In the original game, it's hinted that Shinra have allowed Avalanche to destroy their property as a means to further alienate them from public sympathy. In Remake, this is all ramped up and made desperately obvious. Shinra destroy their reactor at the tap of a button. They proudly pin Avalanche as Wutai conspirators. Wutai being that fearsome rival nation consisting of 5 huts, a restaurant and a pagoda. The plot expands on Avalanche to reveal that it has spin-off cells, some more ambitious than others. President Shinra had an attempt made on his life by a rival Avalanche cell. All this at great pains to distance Barrett's team from any abhorrent actions, which is at odds with Barrett himself, whose original incarnation the creators seem to be trying their best to honour. meaning he has the apparent drive to carry out some of these unsavoury actions, but unbeknownst to him, he is responsible for little of what actually happened in Sector 1, which makes for good, old, wholesome and safe characters. Avalanche's key support members, Jesse, Wedge and Biggs, are suitably expanded upon in Remake, but in my naivety I presumed all this groundwork was to make their inevitable deaths all the more poignant. As it turns out, Remake gives you 2 deaths, but backtracks on both, and just when I thought they'd found a way to make Wedge's demise even sadder, they retcon his death too. In the original game, their deaths are powerful because these characters are there one moment and suddenly gone the next. Their deaths help set the tone of the game, just as their salvation in the remake helps set the tone going forward. A story where deaths can be undone. But to what end? What possible purpose does Biggs serve in the story going forward? A man on the inside of Midgar? But that's Reeves' job. A supplier? That's Chadley, or any shopfront for that matter. Maybe there's no thinking through to be done. As long as character lives, fan happy, right? We're that shallow. Thanks, Square Enix. Yes, the tone has been set. Death does not mean death. The remake performs some mind-boggling timeline gymnastics to restore Zack, seemingly everyone's favourite Buster Sword wielder who isn't blonde. To me, Zack is just a mysterious guy from Final Fantasy VII flashbacks, whose kindness and death paved the way for Cloud. But to other fans, thanks to the Final Fantasy VII compilation, Zack is a badass character who deserves to live again. If the remake creators expected fans to flip out in joy, I guess they judged the fandom correctly, but for fans like me, Zack's return and the return of the Avalanche members are shallow moves that steal away the jeopardy from the plot. If actions don't have consequences, if death doesn't mean death, all jeopardy is dead, and for the game that was famous for culling its own cast, it's staggering to see the lengths the remake goes to try and undo that reputation. Now I have no fear of what happens to any character going forward, because there's a way out for anybody, a way to cheat death, and that includes Aeris. At the very worst, she'll get her own little alternate timeline existence after death, and if she doesn't, it makes the liberal use of bringing characters back from the dead all the more perplexing. Now some fans are betting Square Enix are just setting us up to make us think we can save Aeris, just to leave us defeated again. But if that's the case, then that's a very convoluted solution to recreating that feeling from 1997. It's kind of incredible how Square Enix completely alienate new players by chucking in Zack at the end of the game. Their only hope at understanding the ending is to Google "man with spiky black hair," thereby spoiling the original game in the process. Who is this game written for? The ending is too confusing for newcomers, and for veterans it's too alien, too frustrating. But there's another way this game fails for both newbies and veterans alike, and that's padding. I really feel that setting the entire game in Midgar massively hindered the remake, and opened up many of the traps the game would fall into around padding. Sure, we got to see some new angles of Midgar, but I would have rathered Square Enix flex their muscles and take us out of the city, through the marshes, through the mountains, and even across the sea. Cut all the padding, the dungeons, the side quests, the filler zones. Take us all the way up to the Temple of the Ancients, the game culminating in you finding the most destructive item known to man, only to then hand it over to the villain. Your first battle with Sephiroth would make way more sense placed here, in the Temple of the Ancients, with the fate of the world in the balance. Or just take us up to the Forgotten City, where the original game reached a logical break in the plot. Less of Midgar, more of the world. To be honest, the way Square Enix were selling this brand new Midgar in the run up to release, I expected it to be much more alive, with hidden corners and things you could miss, quests that could spiral into other quests if you talk to the right people, but it all feels somehow empty. It doesn't even pretend to let you explore. Look, leaving all that aside, the padding found throughout the game is simply grating. I get that once they decided on Midgar only, they needed content to fill it with, but some of the new sections are just flat out boring, especially on a second playthrough. But forget that. The real damage is how the padding zaps momentum from the story. Once Don Corneo reveals Shinra's intention to drop the plate on the slums, it becomes a race against time to stop them. Or at least it should be. Corneo dropping us into an extended sewer sequence is barely tolerable, but because it's all Corneo's doing, it's passable. However, the characters dither about without urgency, stopping to collect their thoughts along the way. I'll forgive it, but then we arrive in the train graveyard and we're sucked into a subplot involving a mischievous ghost. About the only thing scary in the train graveyard is the bug I ran into where Aeris was stuck in perpetual motion and Tifa looked like a Blair Witch victim. But the problem with the whole train graveyard sequence is any urgency to get to the pillar seems lost on our heroes, to the point where if anything bad happens to Jesse, Wedge or Biggs, it's these guys' faults for not moving their asses. And it's symptomatic of the whole game. You have to battle through subpar filler that simply doesn't work because the main Midgar story beats of the original excelled because of their proximity to one another. There was a sense of urgency which made you feel like you had a target on your back and you were running out of time. Probably exactly what it feels like to be an Avalanche member. In Remake, it makes it all the more perplexing and frustrating when you see the pillar light up with gunfire in the distance and our heroes get sucked into another ghost subplot, whereas in the original, it felt like a genuine race from sewer to pillar and our friends' lives hung in the balance. Yet Remake still has the cheek to play it off like you were somehow too early arriving at the pillar, making you lock horns with the Whispers instead in an effort to delay your support. Ah yes, the Whispers. Which leads me to the ugly. The Whispers are an intriguing concept, but they don't belong in Final Fantasy VII, nor do they belong in Final Fantasy VI, 8, 9, 10, etc. Yeah, I get that they're a metaphor for fans like me who want to stick to the tried and tested script of the original, and that they're intrusive on purpose. Well, mission accomplished, because they're quite effective in plaguing and poking the plot wherever they can. For fans like me, they're insufferable, and I'm not sure why Square Enix thinks it's a good idea to draw frustration from fans and put up literal roadblocks to drive down momentum. I thought the goal was to create enjoyment. And for new fans, I can only assume they're an extra layer on top of an already busy plot. Their inclusion opens the door to even more plot holes. If the Whispers are so obsessed with preserving the original timeline, why do they let Wedge live? Why do they let all of the Sector 7 NPCs survive? Why do they let the main characters venture into the Shinra underground lab in the first place? Or any of the other filler content locations for that matter, where the characters could be potentially risking their lives and causing catastrophic deviation from the original timeline? When the plate drops on the slums in the original game, Cloud, Barret and Tifa are straight up the wall to Shinra HQ, seemingly a matter of hours after the plate drops, maybe a full day at most. In Remake, the Whispers allow the gang to wander through the dangerous Sector 7 rubble and delve into the dark and mysterious underground lab. Doesn't sound risky at all. Why are the Whispers content to allow that, but only arrive when Cloud spots a glimpse of his past? And what's more, the gang's lab wander and their return to the sewers means that by the time they get to Shinra, surely they're at least a day late compared to the original game. Why don't the Whispers care about that? What if it's suddenly Wednesday when in the original game it was Tuesday? And what if Mayor Domino doesn't work on Wednesdays? And hold on a second, what about that wall market wire in the original game that the gang so deftly climbed? In the remake, I have to do a second lap of the sewers just to earn some grappling guns. You telling me some construction worker moved that wire, the wire of truth, and the Whispers did nothing? They're not consistent at all. Look, I'm just playing by the rules the remake is setting up. By the end of the game, the full extent of the convolution is revealed. Time travel and alternate timelines where fan favourite characters are suddenly alive and well. I used to be a big Spider-Man comic reader back in the day, but I stopped in the 90s when they brought Aunt May back from the dead. Whenever comics want to inject some change into a story, their go-to is to bring a hero or villain back to life. And it's no different to bringing Zack back. It's as if Square Enix first had the idea of bringing him back, and then set about making a convoluted setup just to justify it. And anything goes in order to reach that goal. I also grew tired of comics for their over-reliance on alternate timelines, which in my opinion is one of the lowest forms of storytelling. Anything can be explained away with an alternate timeline, any mistakes can be undone, and Final Fantasy VII, a story which had a heavy sense of finality throughout its unpredictable plot, is perhaps the worst candidate for alternate timeline nonsense. Whether or not Zack meets up with Cloud and Aeris again, or if Square Enix kill Aeris again, it doesn't matter, because all your favourite characters have figured out a way to be together in some other timeline somewhere. And conversely, by the laws of multiverse, it also means your heroes have suffered far worse fates in other timelines somewhere. So what does victory or defeat really mean? Okay, Whispers, timelines, I get it. But what I don't get is how our heroes are behaving. Look at Remake from the perspective of the characters. Forget about us, the player. Just why do the heroes decide to fight Destiny? What about those snapshot visions they witnessed made them decide to fight the helpful ghosts who saved Aeris from a nasty fall and brought Barret back to life? Why are our heroes so sure they want to overwrite the future? Was it a glimpse of meteor that sold it to them? Do they think the world will be destroyed? We don't know. It's never spoken about. I think having Cloud say, "I want to fight Destiny because I saw X, Y and Z in my vision," would have gone a long way. Instead, it's hard to understand why they would take such an insane gamble. It's as if Square Enix have decided, we need to fight the Wardens of Fate, but never once put themselves in the perspective of the characters. Why does Barrett elect not to bring Cloud on the Sector 5 reactor job, leading to Jesse's injury and Cloud's forced participation instead? Why the hell would Barrett not keep Cloud on in the first place? After Tifa went to the trouble to recruit him, and after Barrett allowed Cloud into his inner circle, after the success of the Reactor 1 bombing, after the Scorpion fight which Barrett couldn't have beaten alone, after he and Cloud worked so well together despite their differences. You get the point. From Barrett's perspective, this plot change makes no sense. Why when Sephiroth lures Cloud into an alleyway and the Whispers counter by delaying Eris so she stays long enough to meet Cloud? Why didn't Sephiroth just keep Cloud busy a few more minutes? Better yet, why didn't Sephiroth stop Tifa from ever making contact with Cloud in Midgar? Or better yet, why didn't Sephiroth burst the wheels on the truck that brought Zack and Cloud to Midgar? You get the point. Again, I'm just playing by the rules Square Enix have added in by introducing time travel. Anyway, yes, things are not making sense from character perspectives, and just because people can trace back how and where the Whispers intervened in the plot doesn't make it good. You might get a hit of dopamine because you untangle the plot element, but it doesn't make it good. Just because the Wardens at the end of the game may or not be Advent Children's Three Stooges, it doesn't make it a deeply layered, structurally sound story. Just because you suddenly learned the game was a secret sequel to Advent Children and Dirge of Cerberus, it doesn't make the decision a sound one. Fans usher you towards these answers as if they alone are supposed to prove the story's worth. I could map out the most average plot in the world, leaving clues to a greater meaning throughout, but that doesn't make it good. Some thought gone into it? Sure. Does effort equal good? No. In conclusion, Remake is at its best when it's honouring the original game, and it fumbles and collapses when it reaches for new, unsteady ground. Sort of like Game of Thrones when the show ran out of George R.R. Martin's source material. Except most of the original Final Fantasy VII game staff were involved with Remake. Save for Sakaguchi, who I like to think would have shot down the Whispers idea at its first utterance. It sounds like a Tetsuya Nomura idea, so did Nojima and Katase give him too much respect? Too much leeway? Or was it all Nojima's idea perhaps? Either way, to get this idea past the entire team means a collective effort to distance themselves from the original game. A case of wanting to play in the sandbox of Final Fantasy VII, but not to be beholden to the road they crafted all those years ago. It's a bit of a stretch for me to say these guys don't get Final Fantasy VII and its fans, since they all contributed to the original game. But I don't know what else to think. Despite some fans maintaining the new story elements are a logical update to the original plot, I'm sure if you'd have polled all Final Fantasy VII fans back in 2015 and offered either a one-to-one remake or a revamped plot with alternate timelines, the one-to-one remake would have won by a country mile. And by and large the message from Square Enix was that we would get as near a faithful remake as possible. Their marketing campaign championed and promised a resurgence of that excitement and wonder created by the original game. Maybe they were right, because after finishing Remake, I've gone back to play the original game again, and I'm bloody loving it. Square Enix have promised that the remake plot won't change drastically going forward. It's a bit late for that. Square Enix wanted to create something different, something that wasn't threading old ground, something for them. In one way, it was a huge risk. In another way, it's a cop-out, as it means they've removed the heavy burden of pleasing fans of the original game. They've let us know that they weren't up to the task of trying to pay homage to our memories. They've cut us down early to spare us a prolonged demise. So that's it, guys. The good, the bad, and the ugly. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the game, so please leave a comment and we can have a chat. Until next time, take care.